Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be looking at Resident Evil 7 Biohazard and Resident Evil Village. I know, I've done it all backwards, releasing the review for Requiem first, but I couldn't wait to dig into that absolute gem. I'll link my review to that, but spoiler alert, it's fantastic. But these two games are great in their own right, and I wanted to give myself enough time to play through both of them. And even though they are direct counterparts, they actually play pretty differently from one another, and it raises the age-old debate among Resident Evil fans of how much action is too much. I always firmly fall into the old school crowd. I want them to lean far more into the zombie-fueled survival horror, as opposed to the full-on superhero action games. But we'll get to that soon. Today we are looking at the journey of Ethan Winters from the swamps of Louisiana to the snowy peaks of Eastern Europe. And right now, I have just one question. Is this the definitive way to experience the saga? Or has this franchise mutated into something we weren't expecting? Let's find out.
Welcome to the family, son.
First off, given the fact that these are directly connected, there will be minor spoilers here to discuss that relation. So if you want to skip this, pause now and check the timestamps below, but I will keep it to a minimum. Now, this is quite the deviation from the Resi series formula. There are no immediate, apparent canonical ties to previous entries and characters. Chronologically, this duology represents the most significant shift in the series' history. Resident Evil 7 was a complete gamble that brought new life to a struggling franchise in 2017. Move into a first-person perspective to create something intensely intimate. You play as Ethan Winters, an ordinary man searching for his missing wife Mia. This leads him to the dilapidated Baker estate, a place that looks and feels like something straight out of a Wrong Turn or Hills Have Eyes movie. What makes Ethan so different to our usual protagonists is his vulnerability. He isn't a super soldier like Leon or Chris, he's just a systems engineer with a flashlight and a failing sense of reality. Having been lured to the estate by the Baker family, a mold-infected, cannibalistic, deranged bunch of killers, Ethan fights to find his wife and survive. Then we have Resident Evil Village, which picks up a few years later. Ethan has found some semblance of peace, only for his world to be shattered again, leading him to a remote European village controlled by Mother Miranda and her four lords. In regards to the game's themes and styles, Biohazard channels that fantastic claustrophobic horror and feeds off the fear of being stalked and constantly paranoid, whereas Village broadens the scope significantly and tunnels in on the fast-paced combat and heavy action. Although the contrast between the two game styles divides opinion, the narrative transition between these two games is seamless, allowing you to witness Ethan's transformation from a terrified victim to a man willing to go through hell itself for those he loves. As mentioned, the gameplay across both titles offers a fascinating evolution. Biohazard made the return to the tactical desperation and fear value that launched the franchise back in '96. It's a great evolution of the previous few games, and it has you constantly stalked, harassed, and fearful of what's around every corner. You'll be constantly agonising over inventory management, specifically deciding whether to carry that extra health item or a spare pack of chem fluid. The Madhouse difficulty is a brutal love letter to the 90s, removing autosaves and bringing back finite save resources, forcing you to think strategically about every move. And you also have a casual and normal difficulty. This game also had you locked into a first-person view and encourages you to pick and choose your fights. Enemies drop no ammo or items, making both particularly sparse, and it really plays into the tense survival horror. Resident Evil Village takes that foundation and injects a shot of Resident Evil 4's action combat and cranks it up to 11. In a complete system reversal, this entry actively encourages you to fight as often as possible, as enemies drop an array of items in order to sell to the Duke, a travelling merchant, who allows for weapon upgrades and resource buying. The combat is faster, the enemy variety is larger, and the level design is bigger, bolder, and more explosive. Although the juxtaposition between the two is pretty massive, playing them one after the other on Switch 2 is surprisingly cathartic. The transition between these two styles feels remarkably consistent, especially with the added third-person mode for Village, which allows you to play the game with the traditional over-the-shoulder camera if the first-person view isn't doing it for you. One of many small aspects we saw dropped into Requiem with great effect. And the implementation of gyro aiming across both titles is a standout feature for the Switch 2, and a welcome addition. I don't care if people get bored of me discussing it until it's the norm, or dare I say it, expected practice. I will continue to praise its inclusion and berate its exclusion. Being able to nudge your aim with a slight tilt of the console makes those panicked headshots against the Molded in RE7 or the Lycans in Village feel significantly more natural than relying on the analog sticks alone. It bridges the gap between the comfort of a handheld and the precision of a mouse. And speaking of mouse support, neither game offers it. In a recent interview, one of the producers confirmed they did plan on implementing this, but it was just too convoluted for the gameplay, and I tend to agree with this point. I'm not sure how much it would have added, but I won't be a hypocrite just because I don't see a use for it. I feel like they should have added it if they had it functioning, which it sounds like they did. One interesting thing to note is that the games had different directors. Biohazard's director was Koshi Nakanishi, who also directed Revelations, so he clearly has a preference for the less action-based dynamic, and he went on to direct Requiem as well, so his influence is definitely all over that. But it does explain the difference between 7 and 8, because Village had a new director with his own ideas and preferences. It does seem a little strange to have two connected games with different people in charge, but oh well, it doesn't change the fact that they're both solid games in their own rights. Now, for the performance of these two ports. It is essentially a tale of two eras, because Resident Evil 7 is a PS4 generation title, the Switch 2 is able to brute force a lot of the quality. On the other hand, Village, originally a cross-gen bridge, relies heavily on the console's Nvidia DLSS. Due to Biohazard being an 8th gen title, the hardware can push the game significantly harder, and it shows. The dock performance is especially impressive. It targets 1080p and for the most part hits a rock solid 60 frames. It's not locked, but it might as well be. It's buttery smooth and it feels fantastic to play. In handheld, the internal resolution sits at 900p, which looks incredibly sharp and crisp. And again, it's just so smooth, it really is a joy to play through the game. Village, on the other hand, is a much more demanding beast, being a cross-gen title that leaned heavily into current-gen tech. And in addition to that, it's just more visually stimulating and intensive. You have a lot of particle effects in the snow, some fantastic outdoor scenery and architecture, and the switch in between first and third person, all in addition to the heavy action-based gameplay. There are a lot more enemies, a lot more movement, and due to all of this, a lot less stable in regards to the frame rate and drops. It does utilise the DLSS more aggressively. In docked mode it targets 1080p, but uses a lower internal base resolution of 720 to target 60 frames per second, and straight off the bat, it looks great. The textures and aliasing are much improved, and the game's setting is just visually more striking with that Eastern European scenery. In enclosed spaces, it is consistently sitting at 60 FPS, but once you get outside into the open world and involved in combat, it will for the most part hover between 50 and 60, and occasionally the high 40s. It's not perfect, and sometimes you will definitely feel those frame drops in combat, and from time to time you will also see visual defects on details like the fur on the Lycans or the intricate lace on Lady Dimitrescu's dress, but on the whole, it's pretty ace. In handheld it drops to a 720 output, but thanks to the smaller screen and the wonders of the DLSS and variable refresh rate, the image remains dense and detailed, and the performance even feels slightly more stable. The pricing strategy is a little tricky. As individual games, they will set you back £34.99 and £44.99, or your country's equivalent for Biohazard and Village respectively. Both games have a 9 to 11 hour campaign, and being that they are both gold editions, they both come with DLC. Those DLCs complement the individual style of each game, where Biohazard has a survival mode, Village has a mercenary mode, which is an arcade-style, fast-paced action mode unlocked after completing the main campaign. It requires players to defeat enemies within a time limit, with options to purchase weapons, upgrades and abilities from duke between stages to increase your scores. So if you're strictly speaking bang for your buck, Village does offer significantly more replayability and story DLC. But they are very, very different experiences in gameplay, so you very much have to make up your mind there between the action-based content or a more first-person horror cinematic journey. And if you're only able to get one, that will be the main sticking point. However, if you're interested in both, the most cost-efficient way to pick them up is in the Generations bundle, which contains Biohazard, Village, and Requiem, in one of the most consumer-friendly moves Capcom's done in a while. Individually, these games are priced as a premium legacy title, but the real value is in this bundle, and you can justify it however you like. Either you're getting Requiem full price and these two titles for £10 each, or each game is costing you about £28. It's a tricky one because I would generally recommend picking up both to see Ethan Winter's whole story, but at the same time it's quite pricey. There is value baked into both games as they are the gold editions, which means you get every piece of DLC, including Shadows of the Rose expansion for Village, which provides a beautiful emotional conclusion to the story of the Winters family. So it does leave you with a decision to make, but as standalone games, they are great but very different experiences. Unless you pick these games up in the physical Generations bundle, they are only available via digital download, and even in the physical bundles, they are both game keycards, so make of that what you will. The native release of Resident Evil 7 and Village is just another example of Capcom's current run of form with the Switch 2, and they seem to be setting the bar for all of the other big boys. Don't get it twisted, they aren't perfect. They seem to have an aversion to have different quality modes, and certainly dislike capping frame rates, but they really are testing the limits of the console, and it's great to see. Both of these games really are premium experiences in docked or handheld. The minor frame rate inconsistencies in Village can cause minor frustration, especially in Mercenary mode, and it does feel like maybe having a locked frame rate would have helped, but as a complete experience, both games are great. The big decision you have is, as I said earlier, what sort of experience do you want? Because it's one whole story, but they are very contrasting playthroughs. It does seem strange that they switched it up so much during a sequential story, and the release of Requiem sort of cements the idea that they still aren't sure what's the best direction forward for the franchise, as they just implemented a 50-50 mix of both here in Requiem. In these two games, we have Capcom's attempt to reinvent a franchise that had withered slightly. After the success of Resi 4, they obviously saw that as a green light to go all in with the action, which saw brief success, but it definitely flatlined in the 6th installment, and in all honesty, Biohazard was a very refreshing mini reboot. I'm personally a little bit disappointed to see them U-turn and revert back to the action, but with that said, I still had a good time with it, and I can appreciate that as a complete saga, they do complement one another. As standalone titles, Resident Evil 7 is a top-tier survival horror that very much feels like playing through a cinematic experience. It doesn't quite match the tension of some of the greats, but I thoroughly enjoyed my playthrough and I was genuinely intrigued with how the story would progress. The visuals and performance are fantastic, and that constant game of cat and mouse between you and the Baker family is really good. As for Village, I have mixed feelings. Visually it's sharper, but it suffers a little bit more with that frame rate. It still has its share of classic survival horror, but it's definitely more targeted towards an arcade experience, and as a standalone Resident Evil game, it's a little weaker than I would have liked. But on the whole, both of these games are great adverts for what the Switch 2 is capable of, and with the exception of Requiem, they are arguably the go-to horror games on the console right now. Both absolutely nail the pacing. They do a decent job of honouring what's come before, but Capcom were definitely testing the waters of what to do in future titles, approaching the two games with a scattergun approach to see what stuck. But if you are interested in both, I would definitely consider picking up the Generations bundle with all 3 games in. If you already have Requiem and pick up the physical version, you can always sell it, which will cover the bulk of the cost. But if you aren't in a massive rush to play it, then keep an eye on the eShop. Capcom do tend to have huge sales throughout the year, so I imagine it isn't too long before we see a discount. And that just about wraps up this video. All in all, they are great games with very good performance. I had a great time playing them one after the other. But I do want to hear from you guys. Where do you sit on the Resident Evil discussion? Do you want your games more action and absurdity packed, or do you just like your claustrophobic, more grounded horror? I'll leave a link to my Requiem review. If you plan on picking up the Generations bundle, you have an absolute bang in time. A few small changes could have made these better, but I'll happily take them as they are. Let's just hope that the Switch 2 titles keep improving. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe. I try to be as consistent as possible, and there are usually at least weekly videos. But with that said, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Stay cozy, and yeah, I'll see you around.
Welcome to the family, son.